Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my college football top 25. Not a college football playoff top 25, like where they rank, what teams are most likely to make it and whatnot. That's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to make a video on that. It's pretty obvious to make a ranking on the to make a ranking system on the teams that are most likely going to make the college football playoff. That's pretty easy. This is more of an AP top 25, just like who I think is in the top 25 best teams in the country. And so here's a picture of the ESPN top 25 as well as the college football playoff rankings. Mic noise incoming. Prepare your ears. Oh, I wasn't that loud this time. So on the left, you get kind of a pretty much a replica of the teams that are already ranked. Except when you get down to the later, pretty much after 13, you get some changes. Not real major ones up until when we get down to 20 or 18 pretty much. Army tanks down to 25 in the college football playoff, whereas they think they are the 18th best team in the country. And other teams drop like Colorado and Kansas State. Teams like Clemson and Washington State rise in the AP top 25 but drop in the college football playoff. Louisville has, for whatever reason, a better chance to make it into the playoffs, even rather than their ranking is lower, which is kind of interesting to me because Louisville definitely they are a good football team, don't get me wrong, but they are way out of contention for the ACC championship. SMU and Miami kind of have it on lock with Clemson and Pitt, kind of looking in on that championship, but kind of from the view of an apartment in a street away. They're not really getting much of an opportunity. So Pitt at 18 is Clemson way down here makes sense because they lost to Louisville in their home stadium. So I guess it's nice to see Louisville over them there in that sense. But ultimately, my personal opinion is there's just a couple things that I would change, which we're going to get into. There's just a couple things that I would change about the AP, but I can say the AP is pretty damn respectable. They're pretty damn respectable. They were good. But yeah, let's go ahead and show you mine. And dude, let me tell you something. This took me fucking forever to make, but here it is. Whoopam! This shit took me hours to make. This was hard. Okay? So you got the whole top 25 on the list. I was sick and tired of having very scrappy and shitty looking top 25s when I made it. That was the reason why I didn't like making them, was because the original way I had it set up on the Google, on just the Google Slides, was fucking terrible and very glitchy, unorganized. This is a much nicer way. I would see these things on X and Threads, and these things look so clean, so I try to replicate it myself, and I think I did a pretty damn good job. But it definitely took me forever. So this is kind of my top 25 teams, my AP top 25 teams. So you start off top 3, you don't get anything different from you don't get really anything different from the AP top 25. I see a lot of people saying Miami's not that good of a team, or at least not like a top 5 team. I think that's kind of disrespectful. I know with this, we can't look at the football like this, and you can't determine how teams are. But to start the year, if you look at it from this point of view, to start the year, Miami killed Florida in Florida's home stadium. Georgia just played 4 quarters with Florida, and both of those games are pretty big rivalries. Georgia, Florida obviously being way bigger, but still, Miami, Florida is a pretty big rivalry too. You can't look at football like that. Teams match up differently, but I'm just saying, you look at it, it's like, Miami definitely impresses me as a football team. They've pretty much got a free shot to an undefeated regular season schedule. ACC championship could be a lock. SMU could be a problem, there. But after all, I mean, SMU should have lost to Duke, even though it was a road game. They should have lost to Duke, and Duke did everything they could to lose that game. And while Miami did kind of struggle with Duke for a little bit, they ultimately handled them in the end. Um, and is Miami's home field like really a home field advantage? There's no fans showing up to that game, and I don't really blame them. Miami needs their own damn stadium, for God's sake. SMU definitely poses a big threat, though. But SMU, I don't think they quite match up with Miami. But you get over here to Indiana. Indiana is just smoking teams right now. And they get to play Michigan this week, which was a sellout the moment they entered the top 25. Indiana football is so back, and I actually think it is crazy. Like, I think it is so cool. You see all the fans showing up to the games. That's got to be such a good feeling for those fans after so long. And I didn't know. I finally Googled the Indiana head coach, and I figured out he is the James Madison head coach from last year. This dude is ready to take over college football. He got his opportunity at Power 5, and dude is absolutely changing the game. I mean, he brought James Madison into, like, he was there when they went into their first year of FBS, and they could have gone undefeated if they didn't slip up. And they caused a controversy last year as they weren't allowed to make a bowl game type shit when we were saying they should make a New Year's Six. He caused a controversy there, and he is doing it right back with Indiana. We've got a head coach, ladies and gentlemen. We've got somebody we should watch out for. But, of course, it's all going to come down to the Indiana-Ohio State game, which is pretty interesting if you look at it now because it's at Ohio State. But Ohio State has they have struggled with the higher-end teams. I almost wonder if Indiana could win that. Penn State, I've still got them pretty highly up because even though some things didn't go their way in that Ohio State game, you know what I think? They absolutely sold that goal line. They should have scored their points. While there was a bad call where the Ohio State running back definitely fumbled it, but they said it was just an incomplete catch. That was terrible call, an absolutely awful call. Penn State didn't score offensive points, but you've got to give some massive credit to their defense, and you can only learn from this. So I think Penn State's got a football team on their hands. It's going to be more of a fact if they're going to get into the college football playoff or not. I think they should, but their only loss is to the only competition they've played. So there could be the argument of that, but we'll see how that plays out. BYU at 7. BYU is still undefeated, and I feel like people just gloss over that. And I think it's disrespectful to BYU because to start off the year, you get a road win in a defensive game, in a game there wasn't really it wasn't like a really lopsided game in which BYU just barely won. Both teams had 3 turnovers. Now, BYU had a lot more yards of offense, but, shit happens, right? I just think that win on the road, even though certain things played out for BYU, I don't really think anything in specific played out for BYU. It was a road game. It was a tough game, and it's not like they've completely changed since then. Both of these teams played the same football they've been playing. That's what's so important. It was a defensive close game and a good matchup between these teams that at the beginning of the season made these teams look like they were terrible. Or at least made SMU look like they were terrible. SMU was getting preseason hype of being a pretty good team, and then they lost to BYU, and everybody was like, what? You lost to BYU? And then now BYU hasn't lost a game, and SMU has only lost 1 game. Now these teams are suddenly skyrocketing, but I think that win over SMU is going to speak numbers, especially if BYU wins the Big 12 and SMU wins the ACC. If that happens, BYU is going to be a major conversation in that sense. They could be a really damn good football team. But also BYU has handled some very solid competition. so far in the Big 12. That road win against Baylor is so underrated right now because Baylor, I mean, of their starting losses, like yeah, the Utah loss was kind of stinky, but I guess Cam Rising was actually like there and looked all right. Like he definitely didn't look terrible. And Utah also got a 77 blocked field goal taken to the house. I mean, there definitely could have been some more incentive in that game. Baylor could have taken that one away if shit didn't go bad early. But, that was when Cam Rising was still healthy and not like god awful. When he came back against ASU, he was not quite healthy. You could tell in the way he was playing. He wasn't quite healthy, and he should have just stayed on the sidelines. Even though, the guy behind him probably isn't much better. But with a healthy Cam Rising, like a legitimately healthy Cam Rising, Utah could have been a damn good football team this year. But of course, the same shit happens always. Other than that, Baylor lost in overtime, which also required a Hail Mary caught against Colorado. They lost by 6 points to BYU, and then they got their butt whooped kind of by Iowa State. But that game was also, 4 quarters. Iowa State just finally put things away right before the fourth quarter started. So I guess like 3 quarters, But you look at the BYU game in which it was a 6-point game. BYU actually was up 28-7. And then also 31-14. They were kind of up big in this game, and that looks way more impressive to me now because Baylor's starting to turn their season around like drastically, and that looks like a much better win to me. That looks like such a better win to me. But enough about BYU and frankly Baylor. Let's talk about Notre Dame, who has not lost a game since their loss to NIU, and a lot of people are going to let that hold Notre Dame back, which I think is phooey. I don't think we should even regard Notre Dame in a loss there because if Riley Leonard didn't throw that absolutely hideous interception, they would have been in a perfectly fine position, as well as, I know it was a 60-yard field goal in college or like a 60-something yard field goal. It got blocked. NIU had to pull everything out of their ass in this game to quite frankly win. And while NIU definitely did play better football, they didn't quite, play the best football. It was just Notre Dame sucked. Like, what I mean by that is NIU had almost 400 yards of offense to Notre Dame's 300, and Notre Dame had 2 turnovers, which one of those turnovers ended up being the major game changer that led to the NIU interception or field goal. And then the missed field goal at the end of the game was just Notre Dame. I mean, NIU did miss a field goal, but Notre Dame also missed one right before halftime, so it kind of cancels out. Notre Dame beat themselves down in that game. That was just a game they dropped and should be ignored. I wouldn't say ignored in the sense that like Notre Dame loses another game, we just don't count it. If Notre Dame loses another game, then they get punished. But as of right now, if we're going to talk about ranking this team is really damn good. We've got to give them credit for going into Texas A&M and holding them to such little points. That win over Louisville is starting to look better and better as the days go on. Although Louisville probably should have won that game, Notre Dame got away with the W. And I think the thing is here for Notre Dame is their defense is stellar. Their defense is stellar. And I want to talk about Louisville now, but we'll talk about them later. So I'll move on to Tennessee. Tennessee also is kind of questionable. I've got them dropping a little bit just because they really haven't, dominated this season. Outside of the NC State game, they won by 10 points against Oklahoma. They lost to Arkansas. They beat Florida in overtime. The win against Alabama was definitely impressive. And then they beat Kentucky by 10 points, who's on a 4-game losing streak. You look at who they've played, and it hasn't been like impressive football. It's been very defensive football. Their offense isn't putting up like 30 plus, which I know is a lot to ask for in the SEC, but you look at teams like Georgia and other teams that are doing that. Tennessee, are they really going to compete against Georgia on the road or even against Vanderbilt on the road? I'm serious when I say that too. I'm not sure Tennessee is actually competitive, so I'm starting to lose faith in them. I'm going to slowly start dropping them in the rankings. or at least my rankings, until they prove me wrong, at least offensively. I've got full-fledged faith in their defense, and I think their defense is one of the best in the country, but their offense is definitely something else, and that let's tie that into Texas, which is kind of the same thing, but I think on a more drastic scale. I think Texas has a better defense, but maybe a worse offense than Tennessee. You look at who Texas has beat, and really there's no one special. Like the win on the road against Vanderbilt, that looks pretty good in my eyes. That looks pretty solid. Although, Vanderbilt kind of scored a touchdown with very little time left to make it a bit closer. I guess you could say it was a close game, and it was a close game. It was 4 quarters, for sure. Texas struggled there. But in that Georgia game, man, I mean, I watched that game, and Texas did everything they could to lose that game. I mean, also Georgia did. Let's talk about how Carson Beck threw 3 interceptions, which were just terrible interceptions, one of which led to some of Texas's only points in that game. Texas turned the ball over 4 times and failed 4 of their 5 fourth-down conversions. You could say in quotations they had 259 yards of offense, which Georgia only had 283. Even though Georgia's putting down 30 to Texas's 15, Texas had no offensive motion whatsoever. It was terrible for almost the whole game. Their offense looked like invisible. I was serious when I saw that. That was when I was like, yeah, Texas is overrated. They had a road win against what was ranked number 10 Michigan, and then a road, or I guess neutral site win over number 18 Oklahoma. Those teams are not even close to the top 25 right now. And I told that I preached that they wouldn't be clear anywhere near the top 25 by the end of this season. And that's what happened, and that was Texas's only good wins going into that game. In quotations, good wins. Then they got embarrassed by Georgia in Texas's home stadium, and then they barely snuffed one out against Vanderbilt on the road. Now, I do think there's potential for them to, turn things around, especially after a bye week, but I do think Florida could cause some problems against them. And again, Texas is going to be one of those teams that I'm going to have dropping down a bit in the rankings as time goes on because I just don't have faith in their offense. Boise State at number 11. I may not like Ashton Jeanty as the Heisman right now. I don't think he should be the Heisman. But I can't lie. Boise State definitely, that game against Oregon looks fabulous right now. That game against Oregon, which literally came down to the wire and required two a punt return touchdown, and then I believe there was another special teams play that gave them points. That looks absolutely fabulous for them. Boise State had more yards of offense. Now, Oregon did give them 2 turnovers, so I guess you can make the excuse there, but whatever. It was a 3-point game. It was close. They also have a dominant win over Washington State, who you can see is on this list. As well as they also had a competitive win against UNLV, which also looks pretty impressive. Boise State can win out. And they're a pretty damn good football team. There's nothing that needs to be said there. And Ashton Jeanty, even though I don't think he should win the Heisman, he is breaking records. And he is doing something Boise State has never seen before. SMU. SMU is completely turning around from being unranked at the start of the year, barely beating Nevada on the road of all teams. I mean, Nevada is terrible right now. They're 3-7. They barely... they had to come all the way back in that game to beat Nevada. They were down 13-24 with 8 minutes, or with 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter. They were down 13-24. Had to come all the way back, and then they lost to BYU. It looked like SMU was going to be fart balls this year, and they haven't lost a game since that BYU game. They haven't lost a game. They should have lost to Duke, but they haven't lost the game, and that's huge. They also have a huge road win against Louisville, which is starting to look better and better, and just a dominant win over at the time undefeated Pitt. SMU, pretty damn good football team, and that BYU game is going to keep on gassing them up as time goes on. Iowa State at 13. I see the whole country sleeping on Iowa State. And the reason they're sleeping on Iowa State is, I feel like, because of the opponent they lost to, Texas Tech. Oh, look who's at number 24, Texas Tech. Texas Tech is getting extremely slept on. I've talked about it all year long. They were missing their starting running back against Washington State on the road, as well as their team turned the ball over 8 times, 4 in fourth down conversions, 4 in just regular turnovers. They almost had 100 more yards of offense, yet they lost 37-16. You're never going to win a football game when you turn the ball over like that. And I guarantee you, if they had their running back, they would have absolutely thrashed Washington State on the road. Give them that game back. They're not blinking twice. They have some huge wins. They have a really bad loss against Baylor, in which Texas Tech just fundamentally collapsed. And there's nothing I can really say about that. But they absolutely sold one away against TCU, which puts them at 3 losses. And the bounce-back game that they needed was this game against Iowa State. They did not blink twice. They won that one in a close game that took pretty much – it took a great battle between those teams to end up being Texas Tech's game. And yet Texas Tech is still not talked about. Nobody talks about how they are a 2-loss team in the Big 12. And if they beat Colorado and Iowa State falls, Texas Tech could be in contention for the Big 12 championship. In a world, if Texas Tech beats Colorado, Iowa State loses to, I guess you could say, either Kansas, Cincinnati, or Utah, and then Iowa State beats Kansas State, BYU stays undefeated, Texas Tech wins out the rest of the year, Texas Tech could get into the Big 12 championship, and if they win that, guess what? They're in. Now, I know there's a lot of stuff that has to happen for that, and I could sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but it takes a lot for Texas Tech to go on the road and beat Iowa State like that. Iowa State is a good football team that has proven to be a resilient football team, which is a huge attribute to have for a team. That's grit and determination. That's really good to have as a team. Iowa State was not thought to be a team that was supposed to go undefeated for that long. But Texas Tech out-resiliented Iowa State's resiliency, which was huge for them. And I think Iowa State should not take too much heat for the loss against Texas Tech, because it's only time will tell that Texas Tech is actually a really good football team, and they should be up more in the rankings. Bama, and they will climb. Sorry, before I start on Alabama, they will climb if they continue to win. If they drop one, I'm losing faith, because they got to stop making mistakes. They got to stop making silly mistakes and dropping bad games, because overall, 2 of their losses, Washington State and Baylor, are games they just performed like they just were a different football team. They performed terribly. And then the TCU one, you compete, you're up all game, and you just throw it away at the end. You let TCU come all the way back and take you down. You can't let that happen. If they can patch up things and stop being college players and act like they're really, really good at football, because they are, if they can just put their shit together, they can be the team that they should have been. Bama at 14. Bama at 11 is kind of ridiculous. Quite frankly, Vanderbilt is ahead of them in the conference. It's 11 in the AP and 11 in the college football playoff poll. Now, I do think Alabama's a pretty good team. After all, they have a huge win against Georgia, but you lose on the road to Vanderbilt. You barely beat South Carolina, and quite frankly, you shouldn't have even won that game. And then you lose on the road against Tennessee in a game your offense just was beaten up ruthlessly by a Tennessee defense. And then, yeah, you shut out Missouri, but that's not a ranked win. That's just another team in the SEC. You go on the road to LSU this week, and they're putting Alabama at number 11. They're saying that Alabama is number 11 in the college football playoff poll, which I wouldn't say that means they're the 11th most likely team to make it, but it could also mean that. But it also has to tie into skill and whatnot. But they really think that Alabama is going to go on the road and beat LSU. I mean, there's a lot of people favoring Alabama in that game, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. I also think that game could be really close, and it's a coin toss. But a lot of people are taking way too much confidence in Alabama, putting them at number 11 in the college football playoff polls, disrespecting Vanderbilt so hard. disrespecting them so hard. I know Vanderbilt has lost against Georgia State and a 2 overtime loss against Missouri, which looks pretty bad. But quite frankly, Vanderbilt is a 2-loss team in the conference with a win over Alabama. And they are still one of the teams that is, I guess, fighting for the SEC championship more than Alabama is at the very least. I think if you're going to gas Alabama all the way up and put them at 11, you got to put Vanderbilt in because that's not fair to Vanderbilt. Sorry, not sorry. But Bama is a pretty good football team. Jalen Milroe is just quite inconsistent. He performed so good in that Georgia game, but I think there is something that is not very good for Jalen Milroe is I think he relies on the home field. That home field crowd against Georgia was insane, and I think that definitely carried not only Jalen Milroe but the rest of the Crimson Tide. I think that carried them pretty easily. That carried them a lot because Georgia almost came all the way back in, and when the stadium got quiet, it took a lot, and they're lucky they have Ryan Williams to bail them out. They could have lost that football game, and they could be a 3-loss team. So, I don't know. Alabama will also continue to sort of drop, maybe kind of just chill around this area, but maybe drop a little bit. A&M. A&M at 15. I like them at 15 because they lost that big one on the road to South Carolina. But I think you kind of, as A&M, you get a dual threat option here, but not as you think. You get a quarterback, Connor Wayman, who I don't know if he's still hurt or not. You get a quarterback like that who's a veteran, who can perform well and just win games. And win games against the bad teams. But when he goes up against teams like LSU or Notre Dame that are really good, you struggle. But that's when you can put in your freshman and let him show his potential. The reason why I'm saying this is because you put your freshman in for a game like South Carolina in an extremely hostile territory and a pretty damn good South Carolina team, he's bound to make mistakes. That's exactly what he did, and it led to Texas A&M's demise. He made mistakes in a close game. He was performing well, but then he started to make mistakes. And it just was over from there. He didn't make all the mistakes, but he definitely wasn't making the plays when he needed to, and he got out offense. When you put in a veteran that can make the plays happen and can work by the book, that's when you win road games against South Carolina. But the thing is I think that Connor Wayman kid is hurt. So if you get both of those quarterbacks in there and you utilize the opportunity that you have, I think A&M is like way up in the rankings. Like way up. And I don't think many coaches would ever utilize 2 quarterbacks like that. But I'm just saying there's been multiple instances where Connor Wayman has shown that he is the proper quarterback for the matchup. But there's also been multiple instances where Marcel Reed has shown he can be the quarterback for the the instance they're in. Because Marcel Reed has breakout potential. But Connor Wayman can also, get things done and make the plays happen when they're there and not make stupid mistakes. I hope that makes sense to you guys. LSU has just an absolutely terrible loss against USC. And now, while I do think USC is still a relatively good team, they are below 500 with losses to Michigan, Minnesota, Penn State, Maryland, and Washington. The worst of those losses are Maryland and Washington. That's when they really start to fall apart. And I think if you're LSU, losing that game was just terrible. And you made USC, the way USC looked in that game, you made them look like a top 10 team. You had us all fooled. And that's what I think is bad about LSU. Is every time they go up against a team, USC, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, they make them look like the best teams in the country. But it turns out they're not. Maybe LSU actually isn't that good at football. There is, times where they kick the shit out of Arkansas or they beat Ole Miss in overtime. That was the one instance in which you make Ole Miss look really, really good, but you make yourself look better. But then there's the other side of the spectrum where you get dominated by Texas A&M and you lose a bad one to USC. And you should have dropped one to South Carolina, but you got lucky they missed a field goal. I'm just saying, I'm not sure LSU's really that good this year. I'm not sure I just don't think they're that good. They could drop one here to Alabama. They also could win it, but they also could drop one to Florida the next week, and then they could drop one to Vanderbilt the next week. They're inconsistent, and I'm just not too sure about them. They are in stasis where they are. And they will move up if teams ahead of them drop below them. And they will move down if a team below them moves in front of them. They are in a stasis because I don't know. I can't figure them out. Kansas State. Kansas State is going to get a lot of shit for losing to Houston. But I've seen flashes from Houston all year. I'm an ASU fan. I pay attention to the Big 12 teams more than I pay attention to really any other conference. And I've seen flashes from Houston. I've been paying attention. Oklahoma might not be the best team ever, but Houston, when they were ranked, at least, in a full Oklahoma crowd, almost went in there and beat Oklahoma. 12-16 was the final score. They did have a bad run where they got shut out on the road against Cincinnati and shut out at home against Iowa State, but they turned around and had a huge win against TCU. Now, TCU gave them a lot of turnovers, but they took advantage of the turnovers, and they won a road game. They got killed by Kansas, which I think was Kansas finally just getting the win that they so desperately needed, but they had a good defensive game against Utah. And then they had the big defensive game, the big game where they finally put their team together and put their passion together and beat Kansas State. I think things are looking up for Houston for the rest of the year. On the road to Arizona, that could be pretty interesting. I'm not going to lie. That could be pretty interesting. I think Houston could win that one. Hosting Baylor, you could maybe win that one, but that one's going to be difficult. On the road against BYU, sorry. You're not winning that one. You just got to win 2 more games if you're Houston, and I think you beat Baylor and you beat Arizona. That's a huge success for Houston. And I think, they're finally starting to put together something like that, and Kansas State just got caught in the mix. Shit happens, dude. Road games exist, and road games are killers. It's just the way college football is. Kansas State didn't even play that bad. They had 100 more yards of offense. They just turned the ball over one more time. That was it. It was just a close defensive matchup. That's all there is to it. It was just a close defensive matchup, and Houston came out on top. Don't dock Kansas State too many points for that. That game against BYU that they lost, though, on the other hand, was straight up just domination. They entered a hostile environment. They weren't aware for it, and they got gassed up with the win against Arizona. They were in over their heads, and they got blown up by BYU. But again, don't sleep on this team. They get a bye week before they host ASU, host Cincinnati, and go on the road to Iowa State. They win those games, they're in the Big 12 championship, Colorado's only ahead of them right now because they're a one-loss team in the conference, but their loss is to Kansas State. So don't sleep on Kansas State at all. They are still in contention. Ole Miss is if I could find them here. This is their week. This is it. This is their last chance. There is no way after. Their season is over in terms of college football playoff after this. They have to go at Florida and then host Mississippi State after that. There's no way they're getting back up. You have to beat Georgia this week if you're Ole Miss. And if not, that's it. That's all there is to say to Ole Miss. They've been bouncing back offensively. They are starting to look like a good team. We know they have a good defense. Put it together and beat Georgia. Otherwise, you're done. That's it. Colorado has done nothing short of dominate since their tragic loss against Nebraska, and they really barely lost to Kansas State. They could have beat Kansas State, but they barely lost that one, man. They dropped a bad touchdown at the end, and when it came down to it, they went for a 4th and 5 at the Colorado 30. And if you're such a highly offensive team like Colorado, you've got to convert there. You've just got to convert, man. That's just how it's got to be. As well as you look at what happened right before halftime. They could have gotten into field goal range and kicked they could have gotten in there. They were at the Kansas State 34 right before the half, but then they just took a massive sack, which kicked them out. That could have been the 3-point difference. So Colorado's a pretty good team, but they also did require a Hail Mary to tie the game against Baylor and then win it in overtime, which his resiliency? I don't really know. Colorado sketches me out still a little bit. That's why I picked Texas Tech over them this week. Louisville, just it doesn't get much worse for Louisville. You drop one to Notre Dame after turning the ball over infinity times. You could have beat them if you just played better football. You drop one to SMU in a close game, but you lose it by 7. And then you lose one to Miami by 7, in which you scored, with a minute left, but you had more opportunities. I'm fighting my yawns, man. I'm fighting the yawns. You had a little bit more opportunities to score points, but whatever, lose by 7. That's 3 losses to extremely good teams, extremely highly ranked. You got Miami, Notre Dame, and SMU, a little line, at least in my top 25. Extremely highly ranked teams. Those are your only 3 losses. And then they just straight up shut Clemson out. Who you don't see in my top 25, by the way. You shut Clemson out and just slam the door shut. You don't shut them out, but you slam the door shut in their face. And you shut them up about Cade Klubnik being a candidate for the Heisman. He was at number 9, so it wasn't anything crazy, but still, he looked like shit in this game. Clemson is ass. So, I couldn't fight it. I lost it. I couldn't fight the yawn. It's so late. It's 1:30 a.m. I couldn't fight it. I got to get this video out. Pitt disappointed me after just the complete and utter domination they were handed by SMU. SMU just looked like such a better football team in this game. Pitt couldn't really get anything done offensively, and Pitt has had quite an easy schedule this year. Barely, only one ranked team so far, and that was against SMU. I do think Pitt could maybe beat Clemson since it's at Pitt, but at Louisville, that's a loss. Pitt's season is kind of nearing its end. They just had a really nice start to the year. Army. Now, Army is not ranked without their quarterback, Bryson Daly. But with him, they are actually a really good football team. This team can run the ball, and their quarterback is something else. Navy was whatever. They struggled it. I think I kind of mentioned that when I was first ranking the two military schools. But Army, on the other hand, they've got somebody who's actually really talented back there. They've got somebody who's, making their team known. And that's why Army is staying up here. Unless they were to drop one before the Notre Dame game, whatever. But I'm excited for the Army-Notre Dame game. I'm excited for that one because that could be Army's ticket in, man. That could be their huge ticket in. And that would honestly, quite frankly, probably end Notre Dame's season. Wazoo. You got Wazoo. You look at Wazoo, their only loss is to Boise State on the road, in which it was actually a fairly close game. Both teams had the same amount in yards, pretty much, with Boise State taking it by 40 yards. But the problem was here is Washington State failed 3 of their 5 fourth down conversions, which just ended up just being the burden there. That just ended up being the big burden, the big problem. After they failed in the second half, they failed a 4th down conversion, which led to easy Boise State points, 3 plays, 27 yards, touchdown. And then later in the game, they failed another 4th down conversion, which led to Boise State points. So 2 4th down conversion failures led to Boise State points. I think if these teams get a rematch, I think Wazoo will play better. They also had more yards of penalties. I don't know if I mentioned that already. But, Boise State is also number 11 and played a really close game against Oregon. So I just think that was I can't fight the yawns. It's taking over. I'm getting sleepy. I'm going to try to finish this video, man. Texas Tech next. Texas Tech, I've talked about them quite a bit already. You drop one to Washington State with 8 turnovers and you're missing your starting star running back. You drop one to Baylor, in which you just looked like a different football team, and you let one go against TCU. Texas Tech then bounces back with a win against Iowa State. This team needs to win out the rest of the year and have things go their way, and they could potentially actually sneak their way into the college football playoff. Hear me out. Texas Tech is a good football team. Don't shoot me. South Carolina at number 25. I've kind of been a sleeper on this team. You know, their game against LSU, I took as LSU is overrated rather than South Carolina was good, but I was proven wrong. I really thought South Carolina was super overrated when they got dominated by Ole Miss. But their game against Alabama definitely turned my, got my attention. But then that game against Texas A&M where they just straight up dominated a defense like that. Texas A&M is a pretty relatively good defense. But when you look at a game like that, I mean, it's just a domination. The fact that Ole Miss held South Carolina to 3 points was pretty remarkable. South Carolina did miss a field goal, but they were just I can't fight the yawns. I'm getting so tired. I can't fight them. I mean, at the end of the game, they go for 4th and 4. The Ole Miss 22. You can't get it, even though the game is like practically over. When you just can't keep the ball moving down the field, you're not going to win a game. But that's their worst. That's their worst. Loss. Other than that, you get a 3-point loss in which the field goal barely missed against LSU. You get the loss against Ole Miss, and then the barely lost against Alabama. You've got 2 games that you looked really good in. 1 game you looked pretty bad in. South Carolina's a damn good football team. You also kick the shit out of Texas A&M. South Carolina's a pretty damn good football team this year. Don't sleep on them. But that is my top 25. I hope you guys enjoyed. A like and subscribe would help. A comment always helps, and that's all for me. Adios.